All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We'll let folks kind of come into the room as we're just kicking things off here. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. We're excited to discuss a topic that's really relevant for economic development, site selection, education, workforce development professionals today. And the topic is telling your talent story using data and looking through that lens specifically at the Ford BlueOval City project that is recently announced. My name is Kevin Miller. I'm the marketing director here at Chmura and will be your host today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Just to let everyone know, we will send out an email soon, maybe this afternoon or tomorrow morning, with a link to a recording to the webinar and a link to download the slides that we go through today. So keep an eye out for that. One of the other things is that we also encourage your questions. So as much as you can, as we're talking, put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box at any point during the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many as we can towards the end. With all that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So today, our speakers are Dr. Chris Chmura, the founder, CEO, and Chief Economist at Chmura, Greg Word, the Managing Director at VisionFirst Advisors, and Mark Herbison, the President and CEO of HTL Advantage. For those who are new to our webinars, we'd like to start with a little bit about who Chmura is as a company. Who we are is we provide labor market data and analysis through three main offerings: our JobsEQ software, our consulting services, and through giving folks access to our data. We were founded in 1998 by Chris, who will be one of our speakers today. We have offices in Richmond, Virginia, where I am, and Cleveland, Ohio, but we serve hundreds of clients all over the country. Our employees primarily are economists, data scientists, statisticians, and business professionals who truly care about helping our clients grow their communities and organizations. This leads to what really drives us as a company, which is our client satisfaction and their success. You'll see this in action within our JobsEQ software, where our average response time to a client chat inquiry is usually less than a minute, and the response comes directly from our economists and members of our data governance team. It's really remarkable what they do every day in how they serve our clients, and it's something that we're really proud of and that you won't find in other products that are out there in the marketplace. And really, as a whole, excellence is what guides us and is always what we strive for in customer service and data quality. In addition to excellence, the three other ideals that guide us are being thorough and accurate with our data and making sure that our offerings are useful to our clients. And the primary audience that we serve are in 6 verticals. A lot of those folks are on with us today. You'll see us serving the corporate space and talent acquisition and site selection, economic development, education, site selection, staffing, and workforce. So for those of you that we haven't worked with before, we'd love to hear more about you and about your needs. And we'd also like you to tell your friends. We'd love to serve as a resource to any of the companies and organizations within these verticals. Now, with all that said, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chris.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. What you're looking at right now is our weekly economic update. It's something that we send out every weekend that reviews the prior week's news and looks ahead to the next week, what's coming out. So now more than ever before, it's really important to keep up with the economic reports. And so we're offering this to you, as we have in the past, as a complimentary subscription. And you could click on that link below once you get this slide deck, and you could sign up for it. But just today, for example, the CPI came out. Everyone's looking at inflation right now because it's driving what the Fed's doing. It's making people concerned about the overall economy. Good news this morning, CPI was up 7.1% from a year ago. That's for November. It was expected to be higher. The market rallied right away. I think the Dow was up about 500 points. It's not nearly up that much right now, but it appears that the peak perhaps was in June at 9.1%. Again, November up 7.1%. Good news. Some of the more standouts that you might be interested in, year over year, eggs are still up 49%. Butter and margarine up 34%. Airfares have jumped 36% from a year ago. But on the other side, if you're going out to buy smartphones, they're actually 23% cheaper in November than a year ago. TVs are down 17% from a year ago, so maybe that should be on your Christmas list. And beef and veal is down 5.2%. So maybe time to switch to beef. But in any case, again, please sign up for the weekly economic update. Inflation is still near a 40-year high. What we're looking for, the Fed is meeting today and tomorrow, and we're expecting them to raise the federal funds rate by another 50 basis points. That's concerning because the yield curve is inverting. The maturities that are 3 months out are higher than the maturities that are 10 years out. And that has always preceded a recession. So we, like many other economists, are looking for a recession in the second quarter of next year. So on the next slide, the one thing that we're not seeing a recession in, and Mark noted this as we were waiting to get started here, is with expansion of manufacturing, large mega projects, warehouses. And here we're just showing you an example of some of the recent projects around the nation. And you could see them in just about every area around the nation, some big expansions. On this next slide, now we're showing you that same information, but the first column is showing you what sort of industry it is, the second, the location, third, the CapEx, and then the fourth, the jobs, and when it was announced. We have Amazon there quite a while ago, but we look at that sort of as the beginning of all these mega projects, and that one, as you know, was for the H2Q, the headquarters. But as you look at that second column there and all the industries, notice how many of them are semiconductors. Texas Instruments, Samsung, going down, Intel, Global Tech, and the two at the bottom, Micron and TSMC. And then also look at how many are automotive related. So clearly, we're continuing to see some reshoring. The supply chain disruptions from the COVID period taught us that just in time may not be the best policy to have in all cases. But here to talk to you today, again, Mark and Greg, specifically about the Ford expansion that we're seeing, and I'm looking for that on the list. Automotive, Ford, there it is, the fourth one down in Tennessee. So with that, let me turn it over to Mark.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm honored that you asked me to be a part of this today to talk about the BlueOval City project. I work for an organization called HTL Advantage. I want to explain what that is really quickly. It stands for Haywood, Tipton, and Lauderdale counties. It was formed back around 2009 when they were getting ready to purchase the land for the mega site. The state was getting ready to purchase it. And so they came together on a regional basis and started doing industrial development. And one of the key missions for our group was to promote and get somebody on the mega site. So I came into this role in the summer of 2019 after spending many, many years at the Memphis Chamber. And one of the things I wanted to talk about real quick was the history of the mega site. So the mega site, if anybody thinks this can be an overnight sensation, it's typically not. We've been working on our mega site for around 20 years. And I go back to 2005 with my involvement with the mega site, but it began with TVA starting a mega site program back in the early 2000s. They identified sites around their 7-state region. One of those was this site, halfway in between Jackson and Memphis, Tennessee, connected to the CSX Railroad and I-40, a very large piece of property. After they identified it, we went through, myself and the Jackson Chamber and HTL Advantage back then went through the first certification process with McCallum Sweeney, probably in around 2006 or 7. The county was the first entity to option the property. They paid the first round of option payments, but when the second round came due, they did not have the funding to do that. So back under Governor Herbison, which was 3 governors ago, under the Democratic administration, they took it over and bought the property in 2009 and 10. And so since that time, we've been working on infrastructure, and I'll move to the next slide, which is a shot of the infrastructure right when we started working on the Ford project. We had been working for many years, for about 5 or 6 years, to develop a plan to get sewer into the site. There had been one attempt back in around 2011, but the discharge was going to be in one of our more protected rivers, and the state decided not to do that project. In 2019, they finally finished a plan which was to actually not use any of the scenic rivers in West Tennessee, but build an affluent pipe to the Mississippi River. And so that project didn't begin until last year in 2021. So that was a very long process of getting all the permits and easements and getting all the options on the property, the Corps of Engineer permit at the Mississippi River. And so now we are building that project. We're building the sewer system. We're bringing in TVA and some of our local utilities are bringing in a huge amount of power to the site, about a 50-acre substation that they're building, one of their largest in the entire network. We're bringing in gas from the west and the south from A&R and Texas Gas. We're bringing in fiber. So all this infrastructure is underway today. This is the 36-mile pipeline that's being built to the Mississippi River. It's almost complete, actually, and they're getting ready to start construction on the new wastewater treatment plant at the site, and that will be dedicated solely to Ford and its subsidiaries. We'll talk a little bit about the project in a minute. One other item that has come since the Ford project is a new road infrastructure in and around the site. We've currently got an interchange that's on the right-hand side of that image that you see. It's going to be upgraded, and we've got a new interchange to the left or to the west that's going to be built for the truck entrance, a new divided highway up to another interchange, another divided highway over across the breadth of the plant. And then they'll build some connector roads in 25 and 26 to connect us. So this project has taken almost 20 years. It took a dedicated group of people, especially locally, over 3 administrations under both parties to keep this thing going. But now that we've landed this thing, it's really changed the universe for us. One of the key components in getting ready was what my organization did in 2019 and 2020 was we didn't understand the labor pool. The 3 counties, really, HTL had always used the 3 county population in their labor pool for, promoting the workforce. We did a very in-depth analysis with VisionFirst in late 2019, early 2020 that looked at an 8-county region surrounding our 3 counties. And then in the latter part of 2020, we decided to do an even more involved labor analysis just on the mega site. And so that was really the key to being able to win this project, in my opinion, was being able to show them that within the location of the mega site, they had access to hundreds of thousands and millions of people. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg and let him talk about kind of how we put together that mega site labor study and then how we presented it to the company.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So Greg Word, Managing Director at VisionFirst Advisors. A little shout out to our firm. About 7.5 years old, I guess now, based out of Tallahassee, Florida. Half the work we do is strategy for either folks like Mark, states, utilities, regional groups all over the U.S. right now. And then the other side of our practice is site location services, so representing those companies and helping them find those next locations. So Mark, when I think about when we first met, we had originally done some work for you via TVA to do kind of a very, very small assessment for the region. And one of the things I think that stood out for me is, and it speaks to this slide right now, is like, by the time we get there, we have an impression of you, whether we just know the region as a whole or we've pulled data on you or whatever it is. And so we had pulled a lot of data on you, and I had already started kind of looking at things. And during that first meeting with you, I remember kind of sitting across from you, you were kind of telling us your pitch as a whole, and everything you said was accurate. And I think I made some kind of comment. I was like, hey, why don't you use these 5 talking points instead? It sounds so much better for the mega site as a whole, for the region. And I think you called me the next day and said, hey, what would it take for y'all to do a study, like a more in-depth study? So this was obviously prior to BlueOval. Like we started, I don't know, a year and a half before, maybe a year before, to really come in and look at what the labor looks like. When you think about a product, Mark, you outlined it perfectly. When you look at that mega site, the years and years and years worth of work that y'all have put in on the due diligence side to get that site ready. And I believe you said it a minute ago, is that nobody ever really had done a labor shed study like in full detail. And so that was our engagement with you, is really, let's look at the labor. But like I said, I think one thing that makes our firm a little bit different is the majority of people on our team are former economic developers that have either led states, utility, regional groups, and worked at all variety and levels from an economic development standpoint. And so we get all the challenges that you've been through. And so I heard this my entire career. Hey, we've already looked at you. And I tell everybody that we work with now, take that saying and blow it up and put it on the wall behind you, because there's so much data out there, and there's no way any project's going to look at you without having their own preconceived perceptions about you from what they saw online. So when we initially worked with Mark, we kind of broke the project up into what we call like 3 key focus areas, trying to basically answer these 3 questions. So we're trying to say, Mark, does your region, does that mega site have the workforce that it needs today? A project's going to come in and say, like, help me look at the data today. And that's a lot of times that's what you answer, excuse me, on your RFIs, like, what do you have today? And then the second part of the analysis, and this, I'll tell you at the end of the day, I think, Mark, we gave you about 100 and something pages worth of data to look at. So, but all field answering these 3 questions. Do you have the labor today? Are they skilled, or can they be trained or upskilled or reskilled or whatever you want to call it? And then third point is, how do we look at that future talent pipeline, right? And so that's how we kind of break up the sections of our analysis overall. And we've now kind of branded it from a company standpoint. We call it labor and market intelligence, because not only do we do a ton of data from JobsEQ, but we come in and have conversations, or we have virtual conversations with a lot of employees in the region, the higher education institutes in the region, elected officials, to really get a better understanding of what we think we see in the data. Because again, data is data on the page, and I can come up with whatever story I want at the end of the day, but having those conversations really takes everything and frames it better for us. So that's our kind of 3-prong approach to how we look at this. And again, this is prior to Ford coming in. This is Mark helping us understand, talking to Mark and talking about previous projects and how we can look at the labor assessment for the area. So one of the questions that one of the discussions Mark and I had back and forth is that project has competed so many times for what we call like transformational projects. I said, well, great. Let's go back and not only look at what you have today, but let's look at what you looked like 10 years ago. And so we picked a couple of key areas. We looked at the Chattanooga plant, down the Mercedes plants down in Vance, Alabama, and then Toyota in Blue Springs, and then HCL. And so just from a OEM standpoint, just got on the phone, called some friends, colleagues, clients, and said, hey, tell me what the labor drive time looks like for each one of these plants. And almost across the board, everybody said 85% of our labor comes from about a 45-minute drive time, which is that inner kind of squiggly line. And the rest, the 90%, the rest of the 15% will come from a 90-mile drive time. So that's what we based the majority of our analysis on, is that 45-minute and then the 90-minute drive time. And so we went straight to JobsEQ, set up our regions, looked at those drive times, and I was like, well, let's look at the HTL mega site against Blue Springs, Vance, Alabama, and Chattanooga, and Tennessee. Let's just start. And I'm going to give you a snapshot on these next 2 slides of what we're looking at. But this was just pages and pages and pages of data. So if you look at that second row, we really went back and looked at the population. And if I look just at populations numbers, I'm like, Mark, you come in second place, looking at these 3 areas from a 45-minute drive time. If I look at today's data, again, you come in at second place from strictly a population. Obviously, the population is not taking up your whole labor force. So then we went back and looked at your labor force, the total size, the participation rates. And one thing that we found is, Mark, 10 years ago, I was like, your labor force participation rate was outpacing the majority of these sites around the Southeast and the nation. And it's definitely dropped down from that 65% to that 62.6%. And if we looked at just your region, those may be like alarming numbers to a company, but when we compare it side by side and see that it's a national trend that it's been dropping, it doesn't paint so much of a quote negative story, right? So we can look at it side by side. So again, we had like 3 or 4 pages of columns just side by side, looking at things, how you compare. And so my big message back to Mark and his team is you looked really good then, and you look really good now. So this is the best way that we found to set it up, is just kind of set up side by side and glance, rank things, see how you look. We did the same thing with prime age, so that 25 to 54 age group in the labor force, to see what you look like then, what you look like now, and just look at occupation wages, our average annual wages, and then production occupations, higher education. And overall, I couldn't find any numbers that scared me or figure out why you would get kicked out of a project. But Mark, if I remember correctly, when we talked about this, It was always telling the data story is where you kind of got kicked out. You look good on an RFI, would make it to a lot of the site visits. Anyway, that I think one thing is really doing the detailed look across all the labor. And Mark, one of the big things that we found for you is when we broke up your participation rate by counties, we noticed one of your counties was really, really low, but it didn't match up with all the other data. But we found out that there was a prison there. So we had JobsEQ. We reached out to them as a partner and said, hey, can we run these participation rates again, taking out that part of the population that's in prison? And it took your points back up about 7 points. So this deep data analysis dive, this 80 pages or about 100 pages that we did, we were able to understand and be prepared to answer just about any question before the BlueOval project hit. And I'll kick it back to you, Mark, and then kind of talk about, we'll go back into the actual pitch itself. And feel free to add anything that I just said from the analysis side.
Sure. Well, I think the comparison we did with the other three areas and being able to put all of those data points, in front of somebody to say, look, these three other areas have, one, provided a great startup workforce, but two, these companies have transformed the regions, and we look as good, if not better, even post car plant. And so that was one of the things I think was a key factor. The project really began at the end of February in 21. One of the project managers, a guy named Chasen Haynes, who was actually named Economic Developer of the Year last year in Tennessee, reached out and said he had this huge project. And I've been in this a long time, so I'm kind of jaded. So when I first heard about it, I thought this cannot be real. It's too big. But we started at the end of February providing, it was not an RFP process where they sent in a Excel or a website that we put data in. It was asking for categories of data in many different areas. It started really with the site and the area. It started with, the great logistics location we are. We're the, one of the great railroad locations in the country. We are really blessed with two incredibly robust river ports on the Mississippi River. We invented overnight shipping. We have the busiest air cargo airport in the world in Memphis. So we had all these attributes, but we had this great site, and they were looking to go back to the old River Rouge concept of putting a lot of the heavy stuff on site and really being able to, reduce some of the logistics charges that they would see from those heavy components. So what they've told us, and I don't know who they were, I know who a few were, but they looked at 14 sites around the country. So from February to probably about June, it was pretty much all focused on the site. It was looking at the topography, looking at the soils, looking at the utilities, the projects to bring all the utilities in, calculating the capacities on those utilities, making sure that TVA and the state and everybody could meet the timelines. It was a really compressed, very intense negotiation process. But they loved the site. And so in the summer, probably around June, really is when they wanted to start focusing on quality of life and workforce. They had taken our data and were consuming our data from the very beginning, but they wanted to get even more granular. We did some 30-minute drive times. We did a lot of different things for them as they looked. And so that's when we really brought all the partners together. We engaged with the Memphis Chamber, the Jackson Chamber. We've always had a partnership here with those three entities to sell the mega site. The state brought in their workforce people. TVA brought in their workforce people. We had the people at the state level and TVA level that had worked the other Korean projects like LG Appliance in Clarksville, had worked to get their workforce up and running. And so we spent a couple of months developing our pitch, refining that pitch, deciding how we were going to show them this region. And it was right during the height of the pandemic. So we were very limited on the kind of stuff that we could really get out and show. And so we were able to get a group, though. Ford and SK agreed to bring a group in early August of 21. We spent about 3.5 days with them in Memphis. Again, right during the height of the pandemic, but we utilized every kind of resource, helicopters, buses. We had really in-depth workforce data. We brought Greg and his team in, the TVA team in. We had one group of people that were working with one group of the consultants that were here from, well, actually the employees from Ford and SK that were here, showing them the quality of life. We had another group that spent an entire day with us in downtown Memphis to really talk about the workforce. But we utilized every resource. We showed them the suburbs of Memphis. We showed them all of the counties in and around the mega site. We focused on Jackson, Tennessee, which is just to the east of the mega site and its suburbs. We even went down into North Mississippi into eastern Arkansas. And so we spent a lot of time showing them on the ground the type of quality of life that we have. And I think they were also very impressed with our low cost of living. If you look outside of Memphis and Jackson proper, our cost of housing in this region is probably 75% of the national average. And so we had a great story to tell with cost, with livability. And so we spent that time really selling the quality of life in the workforce. And I think that Greg's going to talk a little bit more about that entire day, really the entire 3 days that we spent with a different group within that team from Ford and SK that was talking about the workforce. But I'll tell you, without this team approach, and I'm bringing this shot in just because this was on August the 8th, Aaron Stewart on the far left, he's our TVA rep for West Tennessee, for 12 counties in West Tennessee, and covers all of my counties. We spent 2.5 hours on 2 TVA helicopters, and we toured a group from SK and a group from Ford all around the region. We flew them over houses and subdivisions and retail and other manufacturing plants and road construction projects, just to show them all the incredible stuff that was going on in the region. At one point, when we were flying over the suburbs of Memphis, I think the Korean contingent were very, very impressed with the quality of housing and the type of housing that they could get and how really close it was to the mega site. But I'll tell you guys, it took us 10 years to learn how to sell this site. When we first started doing, we'd cram them on a bus at the Memphis airport 41 miles away and we'd drive them out there. But over the course of that 10 years, this group became engaged with one another, and we honed this sales process on this site down to really a fine-tuned thing. And so it really hit at the right time. Greg delivered our first report on the mega site in March the 1st of 2021, about 3 days after Ford came calling. So many things that had been going on for 20 years. You know, all the upsets, all the disappointments, all the projects that looked and didn't choose us. You know, it just all kind of converged at the right time for us to be able to land this project and talk a little bit about the project. And I'm going to do that in a few minutes, but it is extraordinary. And, you know, we're still trying to figure out exactly what it's going to mean for us because it's so large. We've never seen a project of this size. It's the largest project in the state of Tennessee's history. And it's the largest project in the Ford Motor Company's history. And so if you give you some comparison, we've had the Nissan plant in Middle Tennessee and in Rutherford County, just south of Nashville, 40 plus years. It's about 6.4 million square feet and 6,400 employees. This is going to open just the battery and assembly, not the on-site suppliers, at around 10 million feet and have 6,000 employees by the end of 2026. And so the magnitude of this is staggering, and we'll talk about those impacts in a few minutes, but I'm going to turn it back over to Greg to kind of talk about.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mark. You know, for those on the audio side, for those listening in, when Mark is talking about Ford and SK, you know, it's a joint venture project. So you've got Ford, the American company, and then you got SK Innovation, which is the Korean company, which is the battery side. And so it was kind of a two-pitch process. And so when Mark called me a couple of days after we delivered our first report, I didn't know if he was going to call and yell at me and tell me he hated everything that he saw. But he kind of did the exact opposite. And he was like, hey, this is the perfect time. And we had this huge project that just came in, and he gave me the numbers. And I kind of scratched my head and thought, is this actually a real thing? And said, you know, we want you to help develop this pitch for, and he didn't tell me the name at the time, but originally we pitched to Ford and got them sold on the site. And then the second side is coming back and pitching to SK Innovations. And so the Ford project side went pretty smoothly, I think, overall. I mean, they were happy with the data. They came back and asked a couple of questions, asked us to rerun some analysis, look at some different drive times and all that kind of stuff. And then the actual pitch for SK Innovation, I believe they brought in about 15-ish people from Korea for about a week in Memphis, and we spent days and days pitching back to the company. So really, how do we turn over and become pitch perfect from the workforce side? So we partner with TVA. Actually, we partner with Mark, the state of Tennessee, TVA, and all our regional people in the group. But TVA and myself led the labor force pitch back to SK Innovation. Again, we kind of already sold forward. It wasn't a hard sell from a labor standpoint, but really had to step in and look at SK Innovation and look at how they view the region. So since we had already done that 100-ish pages worth of data, what we decided to do is come back. And again, we ran it on the 45-minute and 90-minute drive time. They came back and asked us to run it on a 30 and 45-minute drive time. And so not to fight with them or argue with them or act like we were hiding anything, we were like, perfect, we'll come back and pull exactly those numbers, but we're going to tell you a data story with graphics and infographics and maps and really lay out why, answer what you want, and then bring it back to why we're saying a 45-minute and a 90-minute drive time is really what you want to look at. So we spent a lot of time, again, rerunning all this data. And then we took it and built a lot of maps. And so I will side note, my background is in graphic design and marketing. Actually, my background is in animal science, then design and marketing, and then economic development. Chris and Kevin on the call, I don't think there's a pathway set up in your JobsEQ data for that. But if you'd like to set one up, I'll provide you my career pathway that I took to get here. So anyway, we took a lot of data, laid it out from a graphic standpoint, showed them where the drive times that they asked for, those 30 minutes and 45-minute drive time, how it overlaid 2 MSAs, and still were able, and it's pretty small at the top, but we were able to overlay and show what those MSAs added up to. So even though they wanted to see the 30, 45-minute drive time, we were still able to kind of sneak data in there at the top side and show different markets that they would hit in this like concentration of people in the area. So that was like the economic snapshot that we did. And I don't have all the slides, obviously, to show you that we spent 3 days kind of going over, but I wanted to show you some key points of how we use JobsEQ. The other thing before we got back to why we really wanted to promote the 45-minute and 90-minute drive time, especially to the Koreans, is they didn't think that people would drive more than 30 minutes to go to work. I'm sure anybody who's worked a project has run into that from a foreign direct investment standpoint. When you come from countries that are really concentrated, it's really hard to explain mega sites and why they're a little bit away from the city and where the concentration of people are. I said, okay, well, let's go back and address this. So we were able to use JobsEQ and look at occupation concentrations. So I pulled just that manufacturing CTE cluster by place of residence. So that CTE cluster, that career and technical education cluster, and show all the darker the area, the higher the concentration. So we're able to look at that and overlay it with then by the place of work. And so you go from this concentration of a lot of blue over here to more concentrated areas. And so we had more data around this and different charts to show the migration pattern, the commuting patterns, the inflow and outflow of where people were living and where they were working. And once we got them settled on that, and they were like, okay, we do see what you're saying. Because we did explain that we got on the phone and called these other OEMs, but at the end of the day, they don't know me. They could think I just made that up. So we wanted to use data to somehow prove what we were saying from our phone calls was actually true. And so anyway, we showed like these heat maps and got them really comfortable with the idea that people would actually drive. And so then we went back and showed, whoops, I keep hitting I need to use my mouse, I guess. Then we were able to go back and look at more. So the other 2 slides show the concentration where people live and where they work that were employed in manufacturing. And then to take it to another level, now that we've proved that they will drive, we went back to our 45-minute drive time and 90-minute drive time and ran a what-if labor analysis through JobsEQ. And we ran it on an automotive manufacturer, primary battery manufacturer, and a motor vehicle parts manufacturer. And so the reason we did it that way is because if you run the analysis this way, you look at all the occupations that could work for a manufacturer, could work in an automotive manufacturer. So those 60,000 people that were working in manufacturing, now I've come up with 186,000 people in that 45-minute drive time that work in occupations that an automotive manufacturer would need, right? So if you think about it, like if you're locating your first grocery store in rural America and you don't have the numbers, obviously if ran an analysis on how many people work in a grocery store in your town, it would say 0. But if you ran back and looked at occupations that they need, you could look around the town at the gas stations, the food service industry, the restaurants and all that, and say, hey, here are all these people that work in these occupations that you need. And so that's kind of the idea behind the what if analysis that we're able to pull from JobsEQ. So not only were we able to show who was employed in the region, but then we were able to show who was unemployed in the region, those people who are actively looking for work. And then took it another step further and looked at what we call employee extended and unemployee extended. And those are basically people with transferable skill sets. Those are people who are working very closely from a skill set standpoint, and within no more than 10%, I believe it's lower than that wage. So we're not saying like, hey, there's a doctor who's very skilled that could come work in manufacturing. We're talking about very similar skills, very similar wages. And so when we threw those numbers out at them, they were like, holy cow, how did you go from 60 to 180? And we explained like, well, different occupations work across different industries. And so we're building this story with them the whole time. And then we took it another step further, because if you think back to those 3 buckets that we talked about in the beginning of our assessment, do you have the people? Are they skilled in that future talent pipeline? We're kind of slowly addressing that. So we spent those first couple of slides of helping the Koreans in Florida understand that yes, we have the people, and yes, they will drive, they will commute. And then not only are we looking at who works in manufacturing, but who could work in manufacturing because they have the occupations. And then the second side is we start really getting into how do we prove that our people, and I hate saying it this way, but are they smart enough? Can they be trained? Are they All right, I'm back. I think I dropped off for 1 second. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Greg. Thanks.
All right, perfect. So when we go back and look at that skill set, we went back and looked at the education attainment of the workforce. So not just the participation rates in labor force that we were talking about earlier, but the education and attainment of the actual manufacturer occupations within the region, and compared it to what companies say that they need. And what we found is about 40% of the people that work in manufacturing had some college or higher, versus about 25% of the companies saying they need some form of long-term training. And so this is a great graphic that we took the data, reformat a little bit, and basically say, like, you've got an excess of talent with certificates and degrees that, that easily can be upskilled, reskilled. They're already working, let's say maybe at a higher level. It's kind of another way to look at underemployment to a certain extent, which we showed that as well. And then we had another slide where we just talked about turnover rates. And I think, Mark, if you remember, this was one of the slides that they came back and pushed at us pretty hardcore, because I originally had, let's talk about your turnover rates in the region. This is what's going to save you time and money, because every time you turn over an employee, it costs the company money. And so we came back with that 5.9% turnover rate. And everybody in the room was like, whoa, there's no way that that's accurate. And so this was part of the presentation where we stopped, went back over to my computer, pulled up JobsEQ, and I said, sure, let me pull the data right now. This is as of right, I'm not hiding anything from you. Let me copy, paste it, put it in the screen. Let's look at it based on gender and education. Gender and educational attainment. And let's see where those numbers are and break it up. And so we found that really you saw most of your turnover, that really high turnover that brought up that percentage, when you have workers 24 and under with educational attainment not available. So those probably just entering the workforce. When we went back and looked at that 12,000, 11,000 people that work in those different categories right there, it actually brought that turnover rate even down lower. So this was one of the great things, is being able to use JobsEQ, and they didn't kind of believe the numbers. And we said, hold on, let's pull that for you right now, throw it back on the screen, and let's talk through it, which was very, very helpful for us, because really, at the end of the day, you're mitigating risk back to the company. And I love this slide, because this is probably what I wouldn't typically put on the screen. I'd have it like a nice infographic made. But since there are so many questions, I said, well, let's break down the data and look at it. And within 5 or 10 minutes, they said, all right, we're good. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next thing. And then the last thing is, if you think about those 3 buckets, is we were really highlighting all the awards and certificates in the region. We're showcasing manufacturing awards, programs already in place, tons of data from JobsEQ. But what we real quickly realized is, especially for SK Innovation, the Korean side, is we had to stop during a break and lay out this chart real quick to show the pathway from a school system to a career opportunity. And once we explained this, we were able to go back to the numbers again and highlight in the region how many certificates and awards you were producing annually. So it was a really fun project to work on, because the majority of the stuff that you saw on the screen is stuff that we pulled from JobsEQ, maybe revamped a little bit from a storytelling standpoint. And this is the only one I would say we didn't do from JobsEQ, because we just realized, hey, we need to go back and explain this career pathway, right, of how American students work. And once we're able to do that, we could go back and talk about the technical colleges, the community colleges, and the universities, and showcase those numbers, because I don't want to say they didn't mean anything in the beginning, but they didn't understand the process. So like I said, we had a ton more slides, but there's no way I know how to show you 3 days worth of a pitch in about 20 minutes. So that is the last slide I have. So Mark, I'm going to kick it back over to you.
Thanks, Greg. So I'm supposed to talk a little bit about the project impact, and Kyle Spurgeon, who runs the Jackson, Tennessee Chamber, says when he speaks that if anybody can tell you what the impact's going to be, they're not being honest, because, it's been extraordinary already. I mean, I'm seeing in my 3 counties, and you have to understand that 2 of my 3 counties have always been agricultural counties. Haywood County, where the site is and the plant's going to be located, is still the largest cotton producing county in the state. It's always been agricultural. And, with the changes in agriculture and the technology, you've seen a lot of jobs go away over the last 20 or 30 years. And so these are very rural areas. Haywood County has 17,000 people. Lauderdale County has less than 30,000 people. And Tipton County, which is the largest, has around 62,000 people. But we're already seeing in these areas, we haven't seen much growth over the last few decades, but we're already seeing significant growth. We're seeing subdivisions coming in. We're seeing new retailers, and we're seeing a lot of activity in industry, not just automotive suppliers, which has been pretty extraordinary, but, also other things that are happening in the region, in Memphis and in Jackson, Tennessee as well. So what was announced last September was the largest battery assembly campus in the country. They're going to spend, they announced about $5.6 billion in investment to build these facilities. They're going to employ 6,000 people by the end of 2026. And this will be their most technologically advanced and their most sustainable and eco-friendly plant in the entire global network. This is the first assembly plant they've built in the United States since the 1960s, so for a long, long time. This is a shot of their site plan. Phase 1 build out on just the battery part, which is to the bottom of the purple building on the bottom. That's a very extraordinarily large building, around 4 million feet, 90 feet tall. But they're going to build out about 10 million square feet, phase 1, for the assembly and battery plants. They're going to have a number of suppliers in that middle and area to the south that will locate on the site. And they're planning, if you look to the north of the assembly and to the south of the battery, they've got enough room on this site to be able to do an expansion of both the assembly and battery plants in the next few years, so should they decide to do that. So this site is about 6 square miles. You cannot understand the magnitude of the site until you actually go see it. Going to show their timeline. They broke ground really in March. They are really practically got all the steel out of the ground for the stamping and the paint shop and the battery plant. They're really moving quickly. They will have peak construction and equipment installation at the end of next year. They'll spend 24 training and hiring people, installing and commissioning equipment. And then in 25, they're going to start actually running trucks at the facility. Now, what this has meant for us initially is all this spurt of growth, but also what Ford and SK are doing for our education system. Not only have they had the Ford Fund and, all the other arms of Ford Land, and all the divisions come in and work with the communities in the region on growth and planning, but they brought in the Ford STEM people and the Ford training and education people. They are working with all of our 26 superintendents in West Tennessee. They're developing a high school curriculum where if you elect in the 8th grade to in the 9th grade go down the assembly or a battery path. You will graduate high school with no debt and the credentials needed to go to work there. They are working with our Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology. One of the key things I think that helped sell the Koreans, in addition to what Greg and those guys did, was the state is going to build a $45 million Tennessee College of Applied Technology on site with Ford and SK. They're going to embed their training processes into that facility and hopefully train thousands of people a year to be able to work at the battery and assembly plant. The state has already put on another $100 million into the West Tennessee TCATs for upgrades, and the governor in Tennessee last year committed another $1 billion in recurring funds each year to education in Tennessee. We're doing very well financially, and so they are reinvesting that money in education. And he just got reelected, and his plan for the next 4 years is to build a tremendous amount of new infrastructure in Tennessee. So we're going to be the benefactors of a great workforce. We're going to have great in-migration. We're already seeing in-migration, people coming here. And it's really, we believe, is going to transform our region. So with that, I'll stop, Chris and Kevin, and turn it back over to you guys.
Well, thanks, Mark and Greg. That was really great. And just a reminder to any folks listening and attending, if you have any other questions, go ahead and pop them in the chat. We have one in there so far, which is actually a great question. And I think this is a really good question because a lot of the mega sites that are in development are either in rural areas or located outside metro adjacent areas. The question is from Tim Weston. It says, given the site wasn't at the center of the population and a lot of the population was miles away, how did you talk through rooftops not being close to the site?
Well, I mean, that was a concern. There was a concern, and I think that was one of our issues the entire time, going back to 2010 when we started showing this site to prospects. A lot of the major automotive companies looked at this site, was the fact that, and if you understand Memphis and Shelby County, it's the largest county in Tennessee. There's 945,000 people in Shelby County, and Shelby County line is about 12 miles from this site. So it is really close to a large population center to the west, about 150,000 people in Jackson to the east, which, I can be in my house in Memphis and be at the mega site in 30 minutes. And so it's a quick drive out I-40. But when you're driving out there, if you understand our interstate system, once you get out about 10 miles outside of the Memphis area, or even Memphis City proper, even into the suburbs, there's all this lush green space and you can't see the rooftops. They're there, but you're seeing trees on the interstate. And so that's initially how we would get people out there. We perfected that to where we would pick them up in TVA helicopters, and Tim knows this very well. We would fly them to the mega site from the Memphis airport. We would be able to stop over the rooftops in Collierville and Arlington and Lakeland and literally point to the mega site. Just literally, it looked like it was, a couple of miles away. So they would see that perspective on how close they were to actual rooftops. And if you look at the growth, even from the air, you see where all the new subdivisions are being built out toward the mega site, out toward Collierville, Arlington, Lakeland, the suburbs of Memphis. We end at the Mississippi River and always have to grow to the east. And so our big residential growth, commercial growth has been out to the eastern suburbs. And so we were able to show them. And then with this drive time analysis, we were able to prove they could get their workforce. Now we are working with a lot of different entities. We are seeing growth around the mega site. We've had some land bought for subdivisions. We just got funded for $40 million to start up a new regional sewer system with about 4 different counties. And so we're working together on that. So we're seeing growth, but we'll see more as we develop this infrastructure over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and Tim, that's a good question. I was thinking about that. I was reading it after you typed it. And it wasn't so much of an issue with Ford. I think it was a little bit more of an issue with SK Innovation to understand where people lived. But that kind of goes back to the analysis that we did. We were able to show where people lived and where they worked. And then, with JobsEQ, you can come back and not only look at commuting patterns, current commuting patterns, but you can break it up by occupation. So I can look at production occupations, where people live, where they work. And then still going back to those other areas that we looked against, compared against, we were able to show data from like Jackson, Mississippi, for the Nissan plant, how far people will drive, because if there's similar wages, similar similar economies, we can show that the Southeast, how it flows and how it works. But the best part is really when you look at those drive times and look at those heat maps of who's growing the most from an annual percentage, it lit up the southern side of that 45-minute drive time easy. But it wasn't a hard sale, and they actually preferred not to be on top of all the other industries, and that they knew that this project would create neighborhoods to a certain extent, and they want it to be a little bit further away. But I think it's important to note this project was not led by a site selector who could explain all these kind of why mega site sits out a little bit more in rural America. It was led by the company itself, and so we took that into consideration when we were building our story and talking points and telling this. So, yeah.
A couple more questions. This one's from Stevie Phillips. It says, given the size of the project, how has it changed the ongoing recruitment efforts of future projects in the area? Are things pretty much just focused on getting this project up and running? Are other companies interested and not scared to go into a potentially saturated market?
No, I mean, having this talk right before that. I was saying, Mark, we were having this talk right before we got on the webinar, and I just saw it's Georgia Pacific, Mark, is that right? In Jackson, Tennessee, right outside of the mega site, just landed a $500 million deal. And I talked to Cal Spurgeon the other day up there and talked to Mark quite regularly. Y'all are still you have probably more RFIs than you've ever seen before. Is that correct? I know Kyle.
That's correct. I mean, we're seeing all different kinds of industries. We have a big food concentration here with the largest ice cream plant and a lot of different food manufacturing in the region. Of course, we're a logistics hub. So we're seeing a lot, probably more activity than we've ever seen. Now, we are also seeing a lot of suppliers that are looking. And so we're not slowed down at all. We're working very closely with Ford, but it's really transitioned into the workforce side and the development side in and around the mega site. But no, I mean, I think we're all feeling a little bit overwhelmed, quite frankly, because there's so much activity and so much that has to be done. But no, we're seeing an uptick in all types of it. I think the announcement here has caused consultants and maybe other companies to say, now, wait a minute, why'd they pick there? Maybe we should look there. And so I think that's maybe one of the things that's happening right now, but it's great.
I'll say from our site selection side, when any of our company's competitors hit a certain market, this is the first call that they do is call us and say, why did that company go to this location? Am I missing out something? Should I also look at this for future expansion? So when you have a company like Ford announce, it creates a whole buzz across the nation. You would think people say, oh, I don't want to go there because it's going to be, tight saturation market. And it seems to be the exact opposite a lot of times.
We actually had a comment from someone at GLS, from Andrew Ratchford, that ran the project up there that you were just talking about, and said they kind of had the same experience with folks talking about the saturation of the market. Another question is about education. So can you please expand on what you said about education in particular? How have you partnered with CTE programs and regional high schools to build the pathways into Ford and SK?
So Ford and SK both, I would say, I'm trying to guesstimate in my head, they've probably got about 15 people on the ground now after 14 months after the announcement. Several have moved here from Dearborn that have been lifelong Ford employees. They've actually moved their residence here, and they're working on workforce development and talent acquisition and then training. And they've come in a huge way. They're working with our school systems. They are developing what I said is a high school curriculum for our high schools through dual enrollment and CTE programs. And how that is going to work is we really refocused in Tennessee, and Tennessee's doing a great job of retooling the vocational trades. We had walked away from that like the rest of the country in the 80s, but we've really refocused. We're focusing now on 8th graders and before. My organization alone does a huge 8th grade job expo in March of every year before the 8th graders graduate, and show them about 20 different career paths with about 70 different companies. We did it last March. We had 3,500 8th graders over 2 days. Memphis just did one and had like 7,000 8th graders. And we're even going to go earlier because think Ford believes we need to start letting kids investigate vocational skills in 4th and 5th grade. And so how that works is if you can elect in the 8th grade that you want to go down the assembly path, there is a curriculum through dual enrollment where you're taking some academic courses, but you're leaving every day and going to a vocational school. And our three, Haywood, Tipton, and Lauderdale counties, have partnered together even to provide transportation in between the various school facilities, and they're partnering with the TCATs for their labs and stuff like that. So if a kid elects that path, then he can graduate from high school with a credential to go to work in the assembly or battery plant. And they've developed this curriculum with SK, and they've been working for over a year on it with our school systems in West Tennessee, and using the Haywood, Tipton, and Lauderdale County school systems as kind of the guinea pig. They call it HTL University. And so they've hit this region like no other company I've ever worked with. They've got multiple people on the ground, and they're investing tons of money in retooling our vocational training system in West Tennessee. And it's probably the most important and the most exciting thing that's going on right now.
That's great. We had one more question, and Chris, if this might, whether we respond to this or Mark and Greg, said, do we have an idea, perhaps based on other large projects, for what might happen to salary concentrations in the region after a plant like this brings in more technical and STEM jobs?
Well, I can
go ahead.
I was just going to say that, you know, we were seeing wages uptick. It really wasn't Ford. It was the Amazon effect. When they came into Memphis and started paying $15 and $16 an hour, well, FedEx and UPS have huge facilities here. Everybody, you're a logistics town, so everybody in this region had to raise their wages. We've seen it in the manufacturing sector going back to late 2019, right around the time the pandemic started, wages changing significantly, going significantly upward. And I worked at the Memphis Chamber for 14 years, and wages barely moved for a decade, but they have gone up and up and up. We're seeing the average manufacturing company in my 3 counties paying around $20 an hour. So I do suspect when Ford comes in that you'll continue to see wages go up, but Ford's not going to come in with some extraordinarily high wage. They're going to do a market survey and pay top of the market. But they will, not be, I don't suspect, much above top of the market. So we were seeing wages and wage pressures even before Ford came.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Right now, with the big inflation that we're seeing, is what's driving manufacturing wages across the country going up. But and like Mark said, I would suspect that they would do their survey to find out, at what wage we need to hire people in this region. So some upward pressure, but I would not expect it to be anything. I would not expect it to be as bad as what the inflation is doing right now, the 40-year inflation spike that we're seeing in the economy.
So I think we're just about at time. So I think we'll probably go ahead and let everyone get on with the rest of their afternoon. But thank you everyone so much for their time, and thank you, Greg and Mark, for that presentation. It's, with all the craziness in the economic development world with all these mega projects, it's really great to hear from someone who just went through the process. So we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it.